Hey, I don't really like doing webcam stuff, but I'll do it for you guys since I promised to get this posted today and I'm past deadline. From Cross Cultural Conflict from Duane Elmer. Bear with me. It was Sunday morning in the sleepy town of Mananamti on South Africa's picturesque South Indian coast. The heat was very intense. A light ocean breeze offered some relief, but I hardly noticed. I was scheduled to preach at a local church and was afraid of arriving late. My directions to the church were not too clear. I never quite knew what to expect when I visited a church for the first time. Sometimes church services would be held in a garage, sometimes under a big flamboyant tree spreading under a huge umbrella of shade, sometimes in a town hall, sometimes in a tent attached to a residence. The people of rural South Africa possessed boundless ingenuity for creating worship spaces. It being Sunday, the stores were all closed, and since the extreme heat was keeping pedestrian traffic to a minimum, my most likely source for information on the church's whereabouts would be an attendant at a petrol, or we would say gas station. The service was to begin in a few minutes, and I was getting desperate. I spotted a petrol station and pulled in. Inevitably, the attendant was black. Black workers have historically filled the unskilled jobs in this land of apartheid. The attendant came out and offered a courteous greeting. I quickly explained my problem and requested his help. Did he know the place I was searching for? He stood straight and looked left, then right, his right hand stroking his chin reflectively. It seemed clear to me he was looking back and forth to assess how to direct me to my destination. He gave me directions, and I raced off in accord with his verbal map, breathing easier. In a few minutes, though, it became clear that his help was taking me even farther from my destination. I stewed in frustration. Why had he steered me wrong? Now I would suffer certain embarrassment for tardiness. If he didn't know the location of the church, why hadn't he just said so? If he did know, why had he sent me on this wild goose chase in the opposite direction? It was so unfair. Clearly, the man was either irresponsible, dishonest, or downright devious. I had been trained to think the best about the other person and to follow biblical injunctions to honor one another above yourselves, but surely these rules don't have to be followed when one was dealing with people who it seemed were deliberately deceptive. When I first moved to South Africa, I had little understanding of cultural values other than my own. As a result, accurate interpretation of other people's actions was nearly impossible. I could see only through my own cultural lenses. I needed to learn and adapt to the cultural issues of the local people. That would require not setting my lenses aside, but adding theirs to mine. I did not need to give up my own cultural frame of reference to accept and appreciate one different from mine. Like everyone else, I tend to be egocentric. That is, I believe my perspective is correct and better than yours, so I make little or no effort to understand yours. I simply assume that since I have an extensive education and other symbols of superiority, my judgments are better. I don't really think much about this assumption. It's just there. But if I'm willing to pay the price to learn another's cultural frame of reference, I can avoid many conflicts, and in the end, I will find myself the richer for it. In fact, we all need to gain understanding of other cultures, even if we never plan to leave the country we were born in. As our cities become more and more culturally diverse, multiculturalism is fast becoming a survival skill. There are sound theological reasons for committing ourselves to understand other cultures and appreciate them wherever possible. Making that commitment will unfold for us new and wonderful dimensions of God's character, for our God can be properly revealed only through diversity. When God had finished creating the world, he looked at the vast array, Genesis 2:1, and announced that it was very good, Genesis 1:31. To celebrate creation is to celebrate diversity, including diversities of people. And we cannot celebrate out of ignorance. Genuine celebration comes from genuine appreciation. This requires learning and understanding, and these are incomparable with egocentrism. These are incompatible with egocentrism and superiority. All people bear the image of God, Genesis 1:27. To learn of them and from them with an open mind is to discover how God reveals something of himself through their distinct world and life view. As we all know, people have been injured by the fall, by sin's hold on the world, yet God's grace is present in all people and in all cultures. As we submit ourselves to learning from other cultures, we catch glimpses of God's grace that would be unavailable in our own. We're called to love all people, but But can I truly love someone I do not, at least in some measure, understand? Love requires some understanding of its object. That means love is culturally defined. When we truly love others, we love them in their own context, in keeping with the way they define love. We can't express love in a vacuum. It can be expressed egocentrically, my way, or sociocentrically, as the other person would define an act of love. I'm a North American, and in North America we have to find ways of showing friendship and love. One of those ways is to invite someone into my house for an evening and meal together. We set a day and a time for this. Both parties understand this as a friendly, if not loving, act and something that will strengthen our relationship. But in many parts of Africa, an invitation to come to my house at a designated time may not be interpreted as friendly and loving. In fact, it might be interpreted as a sign that I want a formal, distant relationship. Why? In Africa, one shows friendship by stopping in unannounced, perhaps at mealtime, often completely unannounced. If time, place, and agenda for meeting have to be prearranged, the relationship cannot be open and spontaneous and evolve naturally, or so the reasoning goes. Love culturally defined. Gaining a new set of cultural lenses will bring a more accurate interpretation of cross-cultural conflict situations, like my problem with the wrong directions to church. The better we are at interpreting culture, the fewer conflicts we'll experience, the more we'll be able to build authentic relationships, and the greater will be our ability to communicate God's truth. Let me ask you a question. Which is the greater sin? To tell a lie or to lose your temper? Take a moment to think about your answer, then register it in your mind. Take the question at face value. Don't argue that all sin is equally abhorrent before God. Now, what's your answer? Consider why you chose that particular answer. Why does your choice represent the greater sin? Suppose someone else chose the other answer. What possible reason or reasons could support that choice? Don't rush through this. It's very important. Take time to think it out. In doing so, you will begin a process of cultural understanding that will be repeated thousands of times as you attempt to adjust and minister in another culture. Let me make a guess at your answer. If you are North American or from Western Europe, and especially if you have white skin, you chose lying as the greater sin. If you're from another part of the world, my guess is that you chose losing your temper as the greater sin. If you're from the Western world, North America or Europe, but a person of color, you may have had difficulty choosing since your heritage may allow you to offer a reasoned argument for either answer. Of course, here the real issue is not which answer is correct, but why you perceive a given answer to be correct. In Western culture, especially among Western white people, a very high value is placed on accuracy and truth. So lying is the greater sin. Outside the Western world, for the most part, greater value is placed on relationships. Losing one's temper is a more grievous sin because it represents a rupture in relationship. You may argue that truth should be a higher value than relationship, but the reality is that the majority of the world thinks differently. That does not make the majority right, but it does suggest that it might be wise to try to understand why they see it that way. How much does God value relationships? How much does he value truth? What does this have to do with the black petrol station attendants giving me inaccurate directions? Here's the connection. In this context, relationship is valued over truth. African culture typically places great value on courtesy to the stranger and help to the needy. I qualified as both a stranger and a needy person. The last thing the attendant wanted to do was disappoint someone who was looking to him for assistance, and especially when he sensed it was assistance I urgently needed. So rather than disappoint me by not being able to help, and rather than risk my thinking poorly of him, he gave me his best effort. But there's more. In much of Africa, as well as in other parts of the world, not losing face is an important cultural value. It corresponds loosely to the Western idea of avoiding personal humiliation or embarrassment, but it's far more compelling and powerful in determining behavior. We'll examine this issue more closely later. The attendant wanted to avoid disappointing me in order to uphold the cultural value of courtesy and helping those in need. To admit that he did not have what I needed was to bring shame or loss of face upon himself. Both situations should be avoided at whatever cost. One last factor should be noted. The overwhelming majority of black people in South Africa traveled, and still do, either by foot or by public